So you can allocate between you.
3 in the end.
3 in the end, but 2 for this paper. I will give you the 20-minute warning how you allocate between yourselves.
Yeah.
That's your decision.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for asking us to present this paper here. We will talk about the impact of quantitative easing in the Netherlands, although it's a more general story in the sense that it also applies, for instance, for Germany and other Northern European countries at least. We presented this paper also, an earlier version of this in Berlin, so some of you might have heard part of it, but we are working on new elements and we will introduce them during the presentation. What you should realize, and what not everybody realizes, is that quantitative easing is pretty large. It's about 8% of our GDP actually on an annual basis. So it's a huge injection in the economy. And there's no notable result of that in at least the Dutch economy and I think the German economy. So we were wondering, why is that the case? What's happening then? What happens with all this money which is flowing in somehow? And we started to look at that, and that's the aim of our story today, to explain that. We developed a stock flow consistent model. I won't talk about that all the time because you all know about it. We use data on the Dutch economy, and it took me 2.5 months to collect these data, and I wanted to present about 20 minutes or for them, but Huub said, no, it's boring, so I will be very brief about the data, but it's really a hell of a job to collect these data, I must say, and there are many inconsistencies in questions, but we can talk about that another time. So we have a working prototype of the model, we have a consistent set of Dutch data, and we still have to match both, but we are already coming close. So that's what we want to show here. I will first give a brief survey of empirical FSC models, because what is surprising if you look in the literature is that there are not that many what you would call empirical stock flow consistent models. Then I will, well, that's obvious what I will do, so I won't talk about that. So these models, they are, at least the models I discovered in the sense of recent models. The first model is for the Greek economy developed by the Lever Institute. It's estimated for the Greek economy. It's a rather crude model, I must say. The second one was a model produced by a Cambridge group, a UK mod, they call it, and they estimated for the UK economy. I discovered the paper by, thanks to Antoine by the way, by Meijers for Austria, and they took a lot of effort, and I recognized it very well, to find a really deep, coherent data for Austria, and they also present them in a very close way, but they did not really estimate the model. And then the model which has been mentioned on this place about 10 times during the past 2 days, what I call the Bank of England model essentially, and that's also estimated for the UK economy. All these models distinguish between the private sector, government, and the foreign sector. And they emphasize the imbalances between these sectors, which we also have seen already several times in this story, and they stress the importance of wealth effects. What is interesting to observe is that both the Greek model and the UK model essentially ignore the financial sector. They only talk about households, firms, and government, and the foreign sector. So, and the Austrian model, I said already, that has been estimated in a very crude way. So the only full model in the sense that also financial sector is included is the Bank of England model, and that's really a model which you should look at. As a footnote, when you want to look at these models, you have a small problem because none of these models is really accessible. But that's a footnote. And I hope that will change in due time because, well, it will be very interesting to compare the models in a more detailed way. If you look at the Dutch economy, you see the sectoral imbalances, and I want to spend a little time to that. So this is the household sector. What you see is the net financial assets of the household sector. What you see, they are increasing. This is because we have huge pension funds. And I emphasize this is net financial assets because the strange thing in the Netherlands, this is all in ratio to GDP. So about the households own about 200% of GDP in net terms. But what you should realize is that they have a huge mortgage debt. So the mortgage debt is about the size of GDP. So in that sense, the assets, gross financial assets would be 3 times GDP, but you should subtract about 1 times the GDP in mortgage debt terms. And that's the strange thing in the Netherlands, that we have huge pension funds, savings on the one hand, and huge mortgages on the other hand. And that's a lot of discussion about that, whether we should not somehow match these, in particular given the zero interest rate policies, etc. The other thing, which is not really distinguished in most models and also not in the UK model, is that firm savings are very high. And they also put them in financial assets. So you see how firm savings increased by more than 100% of GDP over the last, it was mentioned yesterday, I think, by Peter, the importance of firm savings. And they are often put in financial assets. So a lot of firms put their savings in financial assets, not in investment assets. Standard assumed in most UK models I know of, at least. So that's an interesting observation, and we will use that in our model, by the way. Of course, these increased savings of the private sector, which consists both of firm savings and household savings, should somehow be compensated. Well, the government is very nice around a small percentage of debt. And this is, of course, the foreign sector, which is borrowing like crazy from the Netherlands, and we are exporting like crazy. In that sense, we are very similar to the German economy, essentially, with our current account surplus of above 10% or something like that. So this is the background at which you should consider our situation, our model, and as I said, it has a lot in common with Germany also. So we are strongly dependent on exports to the Dutch economy, about almost 90% of GDP. We have a large current account surplus, currently about 9-10% of GDP. We have a considerable foreign exposure of banks and pension funds. We have a very large financial sector. Also compared to other countries, our bank assets are about 500% of GDP. In Germany and France, they are about 300-400% of GDP. And on top of that, we have pension fund assets, which is really typically Dutch, of 200% of GDP. So we have a huge financial sector, and there are a lot of fragilities there because we have a deposit funding gap, a deposit financing gap, which means that the banks are lending out much more than they have in deposits, essentially, so they have to borrow abroad somehow to compensate for that. We have strongly indebted households, so a mortgage debt of about 100%, and firms are investing quite a lot in financial assets. If you look at that, this is the financial sector I was talking about already. You see how this has increased over time. I can add a footnote here, which I was not allowed to do here, but the footnote would be that we exclude here the tax evasion companies. If you would add them, we would be above 1,000% of GDP. So we have a lot of tax evasion companies in the Netherlands, and they are there anyhow, and they are in the statistics, so you should not really ignore it, but anyhow. The firm savings, look what happened here. These are the firm savings in financial assets. It's almost 2 times GDP nowadays. So, and this is also because of the presence of very large multinationals in the Netherlands, like Shell, Unilever, etc. So you should be aware of that, and that's quite important. And against this background, the ECB is pouring 8% of our GDP in the economy, and you can already imagine where it goes. This will be our answer. Partly of the low interest rates, but also of the quantitative easing, we think that there's a housing bubble again coming up. We had a huge housing bubble in the Netherlands, which was recognized only very late as really being a housing bubble. This is the house prices, and you see that it's coming up again. And in Amsterdam, the house prices are back to the 2007 level already. There are soaring liabilities of the pension funds. You saw that the pension funds in the Netherlands are very large, and if the interest rate is low, it means that the claims which are discounted at a very low interest rate increase very sharply, and this is what's going on here. The stock prices are going up. This is the Dutch stock price, this is the Dow Jones. You see how they are going up, and the euro is going down. This is all a consequence of the low interest rates. Although we will do nothing with the exchange rate, by the way, because most of our trade till the Brexit, but the Brexit is not yet there, is in euros, and the Brexit has not to do with euros, by the way. But most of our trade is in the eurozone, so we use the exchange rate of 1-to-1 essentially. Against this background, I said already, the Dutch central bank, because you should realize that the quantitative easing is through the national banks, not the ECB is doing this, but the national banks are doing this. The Dutch central bank is buying bonds. You see this here, how it has been growing from 20% of the balance sheet to over 40% of the balance sheet. So they have been buying bonds very actively. And what you see is that the financial institutions, their bond holdings remain stable. So the Dutch financial institutions are not selling their bonds. They're sitting on the government bonds, and they are sold. So what's happening then? Well, if you look at this figure, this is an interesting figure. which is also including the target 2 balances. Well, I will not go into that, that would take some more time, but it's an interesting figure. I'm quite proud of it, to be honest, because the red line is target 2 balances, and you saw that the capital flight, till Draghi's famous words, was accompanied by enormous increase in target 2 balances. There's recently also rising target 2 balances, so there's a lot of discussion if there is again a capital flight going on. But the official position of the ECB is that there's no capital flight at all going on, because the banks are buying outside the target 2 essentially, because you see a discrepancy now between the deposits of the banks at the central bank on the one hand and the target 2 balances. And what is happening essentially, I have the figures for Germany, I don't have the figures for the Netherlands. What's happening is essentially the following. A lot of subsidiaries of London banks or Italian banks or whatever are located in Germany, for instance. And this means that although the German part in selling bonds for the quantitative easing program is about 25%, 60% of the quantitative easing program is going through Germany. And quite a large part is going through the Netherlands. So this discrepancy is because the banks are located in the country itself, and therefore the ECB says there's no capital flight. That's a matter of nuance, I would say. And we have tried to develop a model to explain all these phenomena, and I give the floor to Huub.
Okay, thank you, Joan. How much time do we have?
You have 9 minutes.
9 minutes, okay, great. Push it aside. Okay, so based on these stories and these figures, we build a model. What Joan said already, part of these models are already presented in the earlier conference in Berlin, but we're still adding to this model. We already estimated some parts of the model, but that's not yet fully included in what we present today. So we have an FSC model of the Dutch economy. It has 7 sectors: household, firms, banks, pension funds, the central bank, government, and the foreign sector. So it's well developed, especially the financial sector, of course, is rather well developed in this model. We have bills and bonds and equity. So all these financial assets we have included in the model, and equity also we make a distinction between equity, domestic equity, as well as equity abroad. So there are quite some financial assets in the model. I will briefly show here the main behavioral equations, so not the details. So you see here the households have a consumption function, a consumption out of wealth, out of income, etc. And especially for the Dutch case also, there is consumption out of the additional wealth of household assets. So if the value, net value of houses is above the mortgages, then part of that is also consumed, which is typically for the Dutch economy. So that's included in the consumption function. Furthermore, we have a portfolio distribution, Tobin's portfolio distribution of household wealth in all kinds of assets, as well as in the deposits, of course. And we have endogenous housing prices. Housing prices so depends also on, for instance, on the interest rate, which we'll see afterwards, and also included mortgages, which are, as you've seen before, are very important in the Dutch economy. And the firms have an investment function. In the investment function, we have next to the rate of capacity utilization, we have Tobin's Q and the leverage ratio, etc. In that investment function. There are retained profits, but also the profits not retained are paid partly to the households. And that determines also the rate of return to equity, which is then endogenous in our model. And firms, what Joan already said, they don't only invest in their own capital, but also they invest in financial assets abroad. So this is a model where both can take place, and so they have the retained profits. The retained profits are not only invested in fixed capital, but also in assets abroad. It could even be the case that firms are having loans to finance that. Yeah, so that's even possible in the model. Then we have pension funds. They hold bonds and in fixed ratio to equity abroad. So there is already some sort of a notion of having a portfolio model for the pension funds, but that's not yet fully developed. That's still in fixed ratios at the moment. And the same holds true for the foreign sector, where also there is a notion of sort of a portfolio, but that's yet in the model still fixed. So this is a description of the model, which we simulated then with the parameters, some sort of given parameters out of different sources in the literature, etc. So not really yet estimated, and we are still working on the estimations at the moment. What's very important, we think it's very important that we know the long-run properties of the model. Not to say that the model should be in sort of an equilibrium kind of situation. That can be a disequilibrium in the sense that, for instance, the labor market, which is not included, I have to admit, Peter, in the model, but that is in equilibrium. But you want to see, you want to investigate what is the long-term properties of the money. Is it imploding? Is it exploding? What is the debt ratio doing, etc., etc. So we're very interested in the simulations of these properties of the model. Not to say that we are, as such, interested in the long run, but we want to see the properties of the model. Okay, so if you simulate, we have a positive growth rate of GDP, and we have also, if you take the balance sheet items as a ratio to GDP, they all become constant. So that's a property of the model. And what we tried is to approximate roughly the balance sheet as a percentage of GDP to be equal to the Dutch situation, roughly, and that's coming close to what you already mentioned in terms of the balance sheets, the assets, etc., as a percentage of GDP, roughly. Okay, then we have three simulations. Very shortly, we have a QE where the government's bonds are bought through the financial system. We have another simulation where we reduce the interest rate, and the last one is a helicopter money kind of simulation where we reduce the direct taxes. Yeah, we simulate the model for quite some time. We have a shock in 2000 in this virtual periods money model, and we have a reverse shock in 40 years later. Okay, if we reduce the advances, then what we do here is that you have the simulated balance sheet as a fraction of GDP, and you subtract that from the base run balance sheet as a fraction of GDP. And here you see the differences in the balance sheet. Yeah? If we have if we reduce the advances, reducing the advances is in our version, our model, mimicking the QE. Yeah? And what happened actually is indeed what you see here is that the whole changes is purely in the financial system. You see here the government bonds abroad are reduced, yeah? But the foreign sector is replacing that by bank bonds for Dutch banks. Yeah? And because of this of course increases for the central bank, but what they do is they decrease the advances. So it's completely running around in the financial system, and there's no effect at all, or almost no effect at all, in the rest of the economy. The little effect that is there is because of the interest rate differentials between the advances and the bonds. There's a small difference in interest rates, and of course that has an effect on the model. But for the rest, it remains completely in the financial system. This whole action, this whole QE action of the central bank. Let's then briefly go through the other simulations. The red one here is the QE, and you see some changes here in the real GDP, and some changes also here in equity households, mortgages, and in the loans of the firms. Let's move then now to a decrease in the interest rate. A decrease in the interest rate, you see that initially investment goes up, because your financing is reducing costs, so the investment goes up. But there is some sort of an overshooting, because you have a capacity result of the investments, so the rate of capacity utilization afterwards drops again, and so therefore you see here this peak. And that's happening in the interest rate model. And you see here also, and that's very important to see that the equity of the households, because of the reduced interest rates, households start to have more mortgages, and the prices of the houses go up, so their net wealth goes up, and they redistribute their wealth in, for instance, equities. This is what also we saw in the data, where you see this indeed that the equities go up. Now finally, then the green line here is the helicopter money, and the helicopter money mimics decreases in tax rate. So we had a small 1 percentage point decrease in direct taxes. And you see, of course, that the real GDP goes up quite substantial, but doesn't drop anymore. The equity is building up because the households they gain in wealth, as well as the mortgages, but not that high compared to the initial simulation of the interest rate decrease. Yeah. So that's the conclusion of the model, in the sense that you see that there are quite substantial differences between, for instance, interest rate decrease and the tax, the direct tax cut in this model, and also QE doesn't do anything in the model; it just pumps around money in the financial system. So the conclusion of our talk is here that SFC data is very hard to find, especially the stock data to get it really stock flow consistent in that sense. And also who transferred to whom is often not clear. It's not clear from the data. It's some guessing what's happening actually underneath it, and it's not very clear how that runs. Of course, the model should have a focus, in the sense that here we have a financial focus on the financial system, so that limits the complexity already, although already the model has more than 100 equations, etc. So it becomes easily complicated, even if it is a rather simple model. But we have an extensive financial sector and a very limited real sector at the moment. And of course, dynamics are very important. You see that also in simulations, how the effects run, and whether there are lags in the model, yes or no, is very important. And in our opinion also, the properties of the long run dynamics of the model is very important. And not as such for the long run, but for the sake of to investigate the properties of the model, how it works. And of course to see whether a model implodes or explodes if you simulate it for more than just a couple of years, and which we did. We run the simulations up to 500 to 2,000 years to just see, okay, what is the properties of the model, and whether it stabilizes. If you give it a shock, does it stabilize again? And yes, indeed it does, but in many of the simulations you see that levels where it ends up can be different. So it does not automatically go back to the same base run simulation. So in the end, thank you for your attention.